Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. I would like to, before I formally ask for a welcome to Max, I would just like to tell you what is the spirit of these conversations. These are three conversations, one yesterday with Brachetti, today with Max, tomorrow with Topaz. And the concept, it's very simple and very not pretentious. These are intimate conversations for which we invite, FISM invites, magician friends, colleagues to come and witness. And we thought that having Greg Fruing music next door would be helping, just to give it to be a little bit more spectacular. And so these three persons are three very close friends, and that I have known for many, many years. And for me, coming to FISM since 1988 without ever missing one, I believe that the strength of FISM relies on us spending time together. And I remember on the first FISM, I think Max does not know this, but I remember on the first FISM, I was 18, and I saw two stars talking to each other. I couldn't believe they were in the same room as me, so I kind of stayed there trying to get unnoticed, but listening to what they were saying. And those two persons were Max Maven and Ricky J. And I believe that that's probably one of the most rich experiences is what we all talk with each other. So sometimes I would love to know what these two persons I admire or these two persons I don't know are talking about. So what you will see or what you will witness, it's not an interview. We have done that. It's recorded. It's called kayfabe, and there's all there that would be a normal interview. This is just a conversation, and for me, it's a great, great honor to be having what is for me a tradition at FISM, which is spending time with one of the persons that I most admire as a creator, as a human being, as a genius that he is. So now, yes, please welcome Max Maven. So Max, to pick up on something that you shared with me a long time ago. One time you were looking at 40 years of career, and you clearly and mathematically almost divide in phases, saying, oh, it's roughly 15 years each phase and they overlap. My question is this a new phase?
I would say yes. Yes. It's a new phase because in the last year, in the last year the world has changed for everyone because of COVID and many other things. But in my world, the change has been more specific and more personal. So whether I like it or not, it's a new phase.
And one of your many essays is called The Fragility of Mystery. I have used part of that title to express what I believe the pandemic did to all of us by awakening this sense of fragility, not of mystery, but the fragility of life. And I would like to know what happened in your life, not only during the pandemic, but in the situation more severe that happened to you. And saying this with the answer you gave to me during this afternoon, that you are having a blast at this FISM. That I asked you, and you were really happy to be here. But having known that, I want to know in detail what happened to you during the pandemic.
Well, what has happened is the British, many of whom are my friends, the British say that Americans have no sense of irony. And I think for a mentalist to have a brain tumor is ironic. Oh.
Okay, we know because you did a quite graphic post on social media when you got that news. But can you share a little bit of that journey?
Well, it isn't anything I ever expected or even thought about. You know, one of the interesting things about the human species is we are one of the only species that understands mortality. Even not very intelligent human beings understand that people die. But having said that, we don't really think about it very much. We kind of pretend that it doesn't happen. But when doctors give you pieces of paper that have images and numbers and calculations, and they say this means that you only have this much time left, it's hard to ignore that.
Usually, you don't invite us, or in general, to know exactly what goes through your mind at a given point, because it's part of your job. You are doing things and we are seeing something else. There was one of our conversations and where you said something that was incredibly impactful to me. And I even recall one interview that was published under the DVD title of Fabulous Monster, where you tackle some subjects not common to tackle. But there was one sentence you told me, and I would like that you explain a little bit of that journey, because it can be the journey of any of us. You told me that for a certain time you have been thinking how to die, but you were on a phase, you passed that phase and you were thinking how to live. This is incredibly strong. I'm not saying it with the beauty and the genius of your wording, because I can't, but can you share that with us?
Well, I was diagnosed with a stage 4 brain tumor just over 1 year ago. And when the information was examined and explained to me and so forth, I spent most of a year trying to understand death. And then, about 6 months ago or so, I began to get some experimental treatments with some very new drugs, and they began to work. They aren't working perfectly. I'm not cured. The drugs don't make everything go back to normal, whatever normal is. But suddenly it changed the situation, where feeling that I was in the very last part of my life was no longer definitionally true. I don't know how much time I have at this point, but it isn't as limited as I had thought it was 6 or 8 months ago. And as I wrote to a friend when I realized that, having spent a year trying to understand how to die, now I realize I have to spend time understanding how to live.
Thank you for that.
And at least part of the answer, obviously, is to come to FISM.
And I would like to, once we talked about the elephant in the room, that it's important to get it out of the way, and it's so inspiring, the openness that you talk about it, as with so many other things. Let's talk about FISM. What do you think is the real strength of FISM, since we are living one right now?
Well, I love magic conventions. I went to my first magic convention in 1964. And they are really a chance for a community that may exist thousands of miles away from one another, but it's a chance for that community to come together, sometimes only for 1 or 2 days, but to catch up, to see what's happening with friends who you don't see all the time. And so I really love magic conventions. But of all the magic conventions and all the magic organizations, I feel that FISM is the most important. And part of that is because we have to remember when FISM started and the condition of the world at that time, and then what has happened since then. FISM was proposed in the summer of 1938 by Dr. Jules Dautel at a Magic Club meeting in Paris. And he proposed the idea of an international magic convention that was truly international. And he suggested the idea, and this gives you an indication as to how forward his thinking was. He proposed that the first such convention could take place in Paris, but maybe the next one would be in Tokyo, etc., etc. Well, unfortunately, the first proposed convention in Paris, which was supposed to take place in July of 1939, didn't happen. Start of FISM. FISM started in the middle of the worst war that human beings had ever known. And then when that war finally ended, FISM came to exist as a formal organization, and it built on the rubble left over after that war. It built on the ashes left over by that war. And through FISM and similar ideas from like-minded people, this became an organization that represents tens of thousands of magicians who are able to transcend the difficulties and misunderstandings that exist between humans. And here we are in 2022, and the world is again at war. We don't learn. And yet we still have FISM. We are still trying to transcend those stupid disagreements so that we can share something that is more important and more transcendent. And that is that we already share a love and an enthusiasm and a passion for magic, which goes beyond culture and beyond politics and beyond language, and makes us share something together in a way that has continued ever since the better part of 100 years ago, and there is no reason to think it will stop.
Throughout your career, you have always not only been a researcher, a writer, a creator, but a strong advocate for the accuracy of historical facts and the pedagogical side of history. Can you one more time explain why is it so important to know our history before we proceed forward?
Well, I said this last night when I introduced the talk by Will Houston, which, if you saw it, was great, and if you didn't see it, you should have. But when I was introducing that talk, I explained that one of the reasons why I felt that there should be historical talks at this FISM and at every FISM, history is of value. One of the things that defines FISM, I think, is it helps us look into the future and see what is coming, what will be. This is a convention where at the core of this convention there is a contest, and in the contest we meet new and young magicians who bring new and young ideas, and that shows us perhaps where we're going. But it's very difficult to understand where you're going if you don't know where you've already been. So I think we can get a lot of value out of history by using it as a guide to where we'll be going.
There are some events, some stories, some memories that, although we have talked about them and we were always very kind and generous in sharing them, I always want to hear them one more time. And I'm sure because it's not a widely spread story, and we are talking about story, I would like to go back to that day when the creator of the Berglas effect was a victim of the Max Maven's effect. When you met him and you did a I don't want to give it away, so you know what I'm talking about. You meet David, and something happens.
So you would like to tell me, you would like me to tell you
Yes.
the story of how I met David Berglas.
Exactly.
It was 1977, and there was an IBM convention in Evansville, Indiana. And I knew that David Berglas, the legendary mentalist, was going to be there. I had never met him. I was not so well known in worlds of magic and mentalism. And I had heard that David could be a bit difficult, a little bit. And I thought, I want to find a way to get him to want to talk to me. Because if he just says, hello, goodbye, that's not what I want. So I thought about this for a long time. How can I make the right impression on this legendary guy? So I was very intimidated. I was very scared, actually. But I thought if I can start off by doing something that might make a strong impression on David Berglas, then maybe that would make it easier to have contact. So the very first afternoon of the convention, I was in the hotel lobby, and David, along with a couple of other people, walked into the lobby, heading off to his room or something. And I walked up and introduced myself, and he acknowledged that someone was talking. And I said, I wonder if I could show you a technique and get your opinion. And I could feel him reacting. But he was polite. So I said, okay. And I took out a piece of paper, not very large. I don't know if I have one in the right size, but Well, this is about right. So I took out the piece of paper, and I took out a pencil, and I drew a circle on the center of the paper.
I love it all the time.
And I could feel David's blood pressure going up. And I said, okay, we have to find something for you to think of. Do you have any siblings, any brothers or sisters? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, think of one of them. And then write his or her name in the middle of that circle. Oh, and then I did that. And then I gave him the paper and I turned away and said, please write the person's name in the center of the circle, which he did. So you be David. You hold that. And I turned away and I said, now, did you refold the paper? He said, yes. I said, okay. And I turned around and I did this. Your brother's name is Gary. And he said, no. My sister's name is Gaby. You misread the R and the B. Now here's the point. Ordinarily in mentalism, if you're going to do a billet test or a centre or anything of that sort, the whole idea is to get as far away from the idea that you read what the person wrote. Right? And we know many different subtleties and so forth to steer the spectator away from that interpretation. But in this case, I absolutely wanted David to think that I had read what he wrote, using a technique that he didn't know. Because he didn't know that I knew that he only had one sibling, only one brother or sister, and her name was Gaby. And if you caught a glimpse of the name Gaby, and if it was written in capital letters, of course you would assume it was named Gary because that's a much more common name, and R and B are very similar in uppercase. So I did my job in that sense, because now he was convinced that I had read the paper using a technique that he didn't know.
Now, it's funny how you got hold of the information as well, right?
Well, the way I got hold of the information was that when I was growing up, and I was about 10 years old or 11 years old, my parents had two good friends. The husband was Canadian and the wife was English, and they lived next door. And the wife, when she was young, had dated David Berglas. So when I was 10, I first learned about David Berglas because she had some newspaper articles about him. So when I knew I was going to this convention, I went over to her home for coffee, and I said, tell me everything you remember about David.
So the question is, have you ever been approached Max Maven style with that kind of Machiavellic?
Not exactly. I mean, I've certainly had young magicians come up
and showing you center there and
occasionally I'm fooled, but not as. It's not usually as bespoke, as custom tailored.
So, since we are talking about approaching,
by the way, just
please.
quickly, but I was so intimidated by David I probably waited all of 15 or 20 minutes before I showed him what I'd done and explained what I had done. And he will tell you right now, if you were to find David and ask him, he would say, yes, it was very clever, but Max told me much too soon, much too quickly. And he was right.
He's right.
He was right. But we later became very good friends. We spoke on the phone just a couple of weeks ago.
Wow, that's great. So, of course, by liking, by enjoying so much going to magic conventions, and by being such a charismatic and admired person in the magic world, not only the magic world, and we'll talk about that, but you draw attention by the looks, by the thinking, by the written word, by what you perform on stage. Meaning that you are exposed to taking a pic. Can I take a picture with you? And what is the most how do you feel on those moments? So you were saying that David Berglas' blood pressure changed, and oh, not again. You go through that as well. But I am the first one recognizing, and that many years ago I named it, the big wall of Max Maven. Some people cross it, some people don't. But you always have an incredible and super kind social skill in order to control. How do you really feel about those approaches, and how do you learn to interact with those always in such a polite, although effective way?
Well, to be at a magic convention or something similar and to have so many people come and ask for, can you pose for a selfie, or can you sign an autograph or something. Sometimes it's irritating, or the timing is poor or something. But I always try to remind myself that at those moments that the day I will really suffer is the day that nobody comes to ask. And so that makes it easier to maintain perspective. One of the things I've been learning as I get older and older, I realize some things now that I didn't understand 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And one of the things I've learned is that being cynical takes a lot of effort. And it's much easier to be nice.
So when some years ago, during the Essential Magic Conference, we were discussing about panel discussions. One was about children's magic. And our mutual friend David Britland said, oh, we should have Max Maven. And I went, what? And yes, you were part of that panel. And that's when I learned about birthday parties and paddle move and the first set of paddles that you still have that were given on a boat. Can you bring us to that time of the Max Maven birthday party magician?
Well, I started doing, I started in magic when I was 8. And like so many magicians, by the time I was 12, I was a professional. Because at the age of 12 is when I started performing at children's birthday parties. And I learned a lot from that. And a lot of what I learned about magic came from adults who had decided to be nice. There was a guy that I met right around the time I was 10 or 11. I was on a ship traveling. And there was a guy in there who was an amateur magician who had some very nice paddles. They weren't expensive paddles, but they were nice, and they were nicer than what you find in most magic shops these days. And I'd never seen that trick. And he did it for me, and I was very appreciative, and by the end of the trip, I owned a set of paddles. There's no big punchline to the story. It was...
No, the punchline is that you still have them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So when we look back and we see what you were doing in certain moments of your career, there's a pattern that puts you ahead of the curve and in a recurrent position of being a pioneer, exploring new worlds and new fields. The iDisc and the mind games and so many other things, and the touch screen and the interactive, and the list could go on and on. Is that simply a talent? Is that out of the blue? Is that a technique or a method or an attitude that makes you available to explore those new worlds?
Well, I think it's all of those things, but it's not accurate to make it sound like it's just me coming up with these new ideas, these new styles, these new performing contexts. When I put out the Mind Games video, which was the video that reads your mind, in 1984, that was already influenced by things that had existed much longer. There was and I said it at the time, there was a TV series in the United States called Winky Dink. Anyone? Yeah, old people. The full title of the series was actually Winky Dink and You. Because you at home were part of the show. And if you think that was radical in 1984, it was very radical in 1954, approximately. Winky Dink was a five-pointed star with hands and feet, basically, and a face. And during the course of every episode, you would be asked to do certain things. And if you had sent away $1, they would send you a piece of plastic, soft plastic, that if you put it up against the screen of a television, it would stay there. And they also sent you some very cheap crayons. So on the show, there would be a situation where, for example, there might be two mountains drawn on the screen. And then the voiceover guy would say, "Quick, draw a bridge between the two mountaintops." And you would. And then Winky Dink, this animated star, would walk across the bridge. I thought that was fantastic. And so in many ways, the Mind Games material that I developed, some of it strongly influenced by existing magicians of that time, very obviously Martin Gardner, Bob Hummer, a number of others, but to try to apply some of that conceptual aspect and some of the aesthetic, that came from things outside of magic itself. I mean, a lot of the inspiration for Mind Games was a cartoon from the 1940s called Duck Amuck. Okay, not as old an audience as I thought a moment ago. Duck Amuck was a Daffy Duck cartoon that was extremely radical because it was very meta. Daffy Duck would look up and see what was in the frame above him and climb up there.
So all of that way, or I would like to call it attitude towards things that go beyond what would be the natural world, are on the essence of when you say that you were not trapped on US culture as well as you were not trapped on magic culture, because maybe people don't know, but you travel around the world, and very early age your horizons were open. You lived in Italy, you went to Israel. So how important it is to look outside, and what is the influence that can end up having in your life?
Well, in his wonderful lecture today, Danny Ortiz talked about lacuna, or lacunae, which these black holes that people forget existed, even though they saw them a moment ago. And as human beings, we do this all the time. We see things or experience things and then forget what they actually are. Years ago, Eugene Berger wrote a book called Strange Ceremonies, which is a book about bizarre magic. Now, bizarre magic was a movement in the world of magic that really started in the 1970s from people like Tony Shields and Charles Cameron and others. And Eugene wanted to write a book on this type of magic, which usually involves Arthurian symbology and so forth. And something I said to Eugene became a kind of strong tent pole for that book, because I said to Eugene, you know, if you actually think about it, all magic is technically bizarre magic. Otherwise, it wouldn't be magic. I mean, what's more bizarre than a cut and restored robe? You know, we forget, I think, just how strange this stuff is that we obsess about and study and learn and develop and grow. We forget all of that stuff. So I think that we sometimes lose sight of what it is we're actually doing here. Does that make any sense at all?
Yes, it makes sense. Although I would also like to go back to the question and know exactly how much of that openness and awareness, because we see your shows and we have pop culture references and inspirations, and it crosses with many worlds, from art to music to learning things from Clint Eastwood and on the movies. How important it is? Do you think it distracts from the magic, distracts from what you want to express, or you convey it in a different way from your world?
Well, I don't think it distracts, not if it's genuinely interesting. I mean, it's a distraction, at least to me, usually means something not very important that gets in the way of what is important. So if the magic that we are watching is good and something distracts us, then it was probably detrimental to the experience of the magic, but it also suggests that perhaps the magic wasn't that good to begin with. One of the things I do when I'm trying to create magic or teach magic is to eliminate distractions, because I want the audience to be 100% interested in what it is I'm showing them or talking about or doing.
Will we ever know what you learned from Bruce Lee and Clint Eastwood?
No.
No, great. That's what I thought. And do you still collect microphone moves? We need to explain what is collecting microphone moves, right? Maybe we need to go back and go back to learning piano and liking music and Can you talk about that phase of your life, because
Well,
it's unknown for many people?
I learned a lot about performing by observing other performers, but not only magic performers. And when I was young, when I was in my late teens into my early 20s, I did a lot of music. And most of the musicians who I studied, if you will, not studying their music, but studying their performing, were R&B singers from the 1960s. And the ones that I liked the most were the ones who used microphones in a deliberate way, because that's almost vanished now. I mean, nowadays, microphones are so small, you wear them in your hair or in your ear, in your lapel. Nothing wrong with that, but then there's nothing to work with. And so a microphone can be a form of focus or punctuation. Just because it's an object you can do things with. And I particularly liked watching people working with microphones that were on a stand, and particularly a straight stand with a circular weighted base. And I have mentioned this to a number of friends because I know they listen, because Luis de Matos owns a straight mic stand on a circular weighted base. Because that type of mic stand handles differently than one with a tripod base or a triangular weighted base, or it's just different. You can do things, and there are moves you can do with them that will accentuate something you're saying, or change the focus, or change the visual balance of the stage. And I learned more from watching performers like James Brown and Jackie Wilson and Joe Tex and their mic work than I learned from watching anybody else as far as working with a microphone. Because by the time I was starting to see that, it was already starting to disappear. As mics became smaller and lighter, you found more and more performers who used mic stands, whether they were comedians or singers, who had been taught basically ignore the mic, pretend it's not there, minimize its existence. Well, if I'd done that, I would have been pretty uninteresting on stage, I think, back in those days.
So I asked a mutual friend of ours. I share with him that we would having this intimate conversation in public, and we call him. I call him very dearly Mr. Brains. We are talking about David Britland, our mutual friend, and through WhatsApp I asked him, please send me 3 questions that I can ask Max. And one of the questions that he sent me is, what qualities does it take to become a successful professional performer?
I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I'm not sure I've ever been a successful professional performer, because that depends on what you're using to define success, right? I mean, if success is making lots of money from your performing, which certainly is the definition many people would use, then I've been a failure most of my life, because money has never been my most important goal in performing. But I think I have had some genuine success in performing. I think I've, at many times, not consistently maybe, but at many times, I've come very close to achieving what I tried to achieve with my shows. Not necessarily financial, but that's not what my goal was. The goal was to create an experience for the audience that change their lives using the medium of what I do to change them. I want my audiences at the end of a show to come out of the theater or the nightclub or wherever it may be, changed. Now, I'm not so foolish or egotistical to assume that I can make a huge change in a person's life, but I can make small changes, and those can add up.
And you are ready to please the three kinds of audiences that you consider are the audiences of your shows, which also are the same three kind of audiences that love to see wrestling. And I love your description of the three kinds of audience. Can you go through that briefly?
As some of you may know, I am a big fan of professional wrestling. And although I had seen wrestling when I was a kid, I was never specifically a fan until I was in my mid to late 20s. Later than that, mid to late 30s, and even into my early 40s. And this confused me when I realized this, because I'm not a big sports fan. And yet here was this thing that was similar to sports, and I was watching it on purpose. And I said, somehow this is resonating with me, and I don't think I understand why. And that bothered me to the point that I began to analyze it. And I realized that professional wrestling and mentalism are extremely similar. And what I finally realized was the audience for professional wrestling is basically in three categories. And there's one portion of the overall audience for professional wrestling that believes that everything that they are looking at when they see a wrestling show is fake. So if it looks like this guy broke his arm, no, he's acting like it broke. If it looks like he's bleeding, it's fake blood. And if it seems like he's very angry and upset, it was scripted. But then there's another part of the audience that is willing to believe that everything it sees is true. It didn't just look like this guy broke his arm. He broke his arm. And that's real blood. And those two guys are not good enough actors to pretend that they're mad at each other. So everything is real. But then there's the third group, which is by far the biggest group, although I wouldn't be able to estimate what the ratio is. And that group says, okay, look, I know that some of this, maybe a lot of it, maybe even most of it, is bullshit. But I don't think the human arm can actually bend that way. And yeah, you can put fake blood into a capsule, but how do you get it to bleed out of someone's forehead? And acting convincingly is something that even great actors have a hard time with, and these are not necessarily great actors. So I think some of this is nonsense, or artifice, or magic tricks. But I think some of this is real, and I don't know where to put the dividing marker. Well, when I thought of that, I realized that's my audience.
And that leads me into the next question, which has, of course, which is related to this. It's also suggested by David, and he said, in mentalism, there is a discussion about disclaimers. Should the performer give the audience some clue that what they are watching is a theatrical performance? When I saw the character Max Maven, I thought this is theater. There is no need for a disclaimer. Was this part of your plan? And what are your thoughts about the performance of mentalism extending beyond the stage and assumed by the audience to be real?
Okay. The first question is, I mean, he's right. When you are groomed the way I have groomed myself for my entire adult life, my professional career, that by itself is a form of disclaimer because it says to the audience, this is theatrical. And so I've never felt that explicit disclaimers are very necessary for me because I don't think my audience is quite that crazy. But having said that, it's also something that anyone who does mentalism, whether they're a professional or an amateur, whether they have been doing it a long time or they're just starting, part of what comes along with mentalism is that the audience is going to take some of it and interpret it in a way that you may not have intended. And that's still your responsibility. So doing mentalism brings with it some responsibilities that you may not have initially realized were responsibilities. Now, what you do with disclaimers is kind of up to you. You have to be comfortable with whatever that outcome is, because you have to accept the fact that disclaimers don't work. David Hoy, in the 1960s, used to work nightclubs under the name Dr. Faust. And Dave would work nightclubs, and his opening line of his nightclub show was, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Faust, and I'm a fake." I don't know that there's ever been a more explicit disclaimer. And yet people would come up to Dave after a show and say, okay, I know you say that thing about faking because probably there's some legal need to do it, but you can tell me, when did you realize you had these powers? So disclaimers don't work. So the only thing disclaimers really do is to make certain people who feel guilty about mentalism feel less guilty. So I think it's up to every individual who wants to perform mentalism, no matter what style and no matter what context, to think about the fact, and it is a fact, to think about the fact that there are going to be members of the audience who would interpret what you do differently than you thought they would, in ways that most performers do not have to worry about. At the end of Hamlet, the actors do not suddenly stand up and say, we're okay. We weren't really poisoned and stabbed. Don't worry. It's all a show. It's written by a guy named Shakespeare hundreds of years ago, and we hope you were excited and thrilled and worried, but now we can all go home. And that doesn't happen in a mentalism show. And you, as an individual, if you're going to perform mentalism, have to understand that you don't have that ability, you don't have that option to say to the audience, don't worry, everything's fine, and leave. Now, what your choice is, what your decision is, that's up to you.
So, talking about decisions and informed decisions and taking advantage of the fact that we are speaking with you, and because time flies, there's a phrase in the song, and it says, if I knew then what I know now. And this leads into the question, which is, what are the things you learned about performing that really surprised you at a certain point in life?
I actually think I learned this fairly early, but I learned it more and more and more over time, and that is in magic in general and in mentalism in particular, failure does not mean death. You know, you can drop a prop, accidentally flash a gimmick or something, and you'll be there the next day to drink your coffee in the morning and continue. People are so terrified. You know, they've done surveys of Western culture, Americans, but others as well, as to what are people the most scared of. And the top thing on the list, people are more scared of it than going to dentistry or, you know, climbing on high bridges or something, is public speaking. Most people, that is the thing they are most afraid of. And that's what we do all the time. For many of us, it's what we do literally every day. And somehow we don't die. I've fallen down from very great conceptual heights. There isn't a single item in my repertoire that hasn't gone wrong. And so far, at least, I haven't died.
So, our conversation started a few decades ago, and I can only wish that it continues for some more decades. And I would like that each of you here this afternoon, during these few days, continue this conversation in every way you want. I mean, approach Max. Be aware of it might be busy, but try to continue this conversation in whichever way you prefer to do it, being assured that you'll be a different person after that conversation, like I am different for having had the honor and the pleasure of sharing so many moments with you throughout the time we have known each other. And I can only say, as we are reaching the time where we need to finish, I can only say, thank you so much, Max. Thank you. Max Maven.
A few hours ago, I was talking with Luis, and he asked me to make him a promise, and the promise that would be that I would attend the next FISM. And I said I would try.
Accept the challenge.
According to my doctors, I probably won't be at the next FISM. Fuck them.